In the middle of the Indian Ocean lies an island so small it barely appears on early maps. No trees, no fresh water, no reason to stop. In 1761, a French ship struck its reef by mistake and disappeared. Most of those who reached the shore were eventually taken away, but some were left behind, not for days, not for months, for 15 years. What followed was not a story of adventure, but of quiet survival, built from debris, routine, and time without measure. Tromelin Island sits alone in the western Indian Ocean, east of Madagascar and north of Réunion. It is small, flat, and ringed by shallow reefs. From the air, it appears as a pale oval against dark water. From sea level, it is barely visible until a vessel is close. The island rises only a few meters above the surrounding ocean, offering no shelter from wind or sun. There are no trees on Tromelin. The ground is coral limestone, broken into sharp fragments by centuries of wave action. Salt carried by the wind settles on every surface. Rain is infrequent and unpredictable. Fresh water does not collect naturally, and there are no streams or springs. The only consistent movement is the surf breaking along the reef and the seabirds that circle overhead. In the 18th century, Tromelin had no name commonly used by sailors. It lay far from established ports and outside regular shipping lanes. Maps marked it vaguely, if at all. Ships crossing this part of the ocean did so to shorten long voyages between Europe, Africa, and Asia, accepting the risk of uncharted shallows in exchange for time. The island offered nothing of value to passing crews. It had no timber, no fertile soil, and no safe anchorage. For most navigators, Tromelin was something to avoid rather than approach. It was a place defined by absence, sustained only by the sea around it. In the middle of the 18th century, France was deeply involved in maritime trade across the Indian Ocean. The French East India Company operated ships that moved between ports in Europe, Africa, and Asia, carrying goods, personnel, and, increasingly, enslaved people. These voyages were long and vulnerable to weather, navigation errors, and political conflict. The ship involved in this story was the Utile, a French East India Company vessel launched in the 1750s. In 1761, it departed from Bayonne on the Atlantic coast of France, bound for L'Île-de-France, now known as Mauritius. The ship's purpose was logistical rather than exploratory. It was part of a network that sustained French colonial presence in the Indian Ocean. Before reaching its destination, the Utile made a stop on the coast of Madagascar. There, the ship took on a human cargo. More than 100 Malagasy men and women were forced aboard, purchased to be sold as enslaved labor on L'Île-de-France. This transaction violated French law at the time, which restricted the slave trade in certain territories, but enforcement was inconsistent. Company officials and ship officers often acted outside formal regulations. The enslaved individuals came from different regions of Madagascar. Their specific identities, languages, and backgrounds were not recorded in surviving documents. What is known comes from cargo lists and later reports, which counted them only as numbers. They were placed below deck, in conditions typical of the period, crowded, dark, and poorly ventilated. The Utile's crew consisted of sailors, officers, and specialists required to operate a long-distance merchant vessel. They relied on dead reckoning and celestial navigation. Charts of the Indian Ocean were incomplete, particularly in areas far from major ports. Small islands and reefs were often misplaced or omitted entirely. As the ship approached the western Indian Ocean, it followed a southern route intended to catch favorable winds. This course brought it closer to poorly mapped waters. The decision reflected common practice at the time. Speed and efficiency were prioritized, even when the margin for error was narrow. By late July of 1761, the Utile was nearing the final stage of its journey. The crew believed they were clear of major hazards. The island that would later be called Tromelin was not expected to be directly in their path. There was no indication, in the ship's planning or records, that anyone anticipated what was about to occur. On the night of 31 July 1761, the Utile struck a reef. The impact was sudden and decisive. The ship had misjudged its position, sailing farther east than intended. Tromelin Island lay directly ahead, its surrounding coral shelf hidden beneath the surface of the water. The hull was breached almost immediately. Waves drove the ship onto the reef, breaking its structure apart. In the darkness, there was little coordination. Crew members attempted to secure the vessel, but the force of the sea made further movement impossible. Water flooded the lower decks, where the enslaved Malagasy were confined. Some of those below deck drowned before they could reach the surface. Others managed to escape as the ship broke apart. Survivors from both the crew and the captive population were thrown into the water or clung to debris. The reef, though lethal to the ship, prevented it from sinking completely and allowed some people to reach land. By morning, the remains of the Utile were scattered across the reef. The island itself was visible for the first time to the survivors. It was small, exposed, and offered no immediate resources. The survivors gathered what they could from the wreckage as waves continued to destroy what remained of the ship. Records indicate that roughly 60 Malagasy men and women survived the wreck, along with the majority of the French crew. The exact number is uncertain, as counts differed between reports written later. What is clear is that the island now held two groups, bound by circumstance, but separated by status and authority. Within days, the crew established a temporary camp. They recovered tools, wood, sailcloth, and food supplies that washed ashore. The island's limitations became quickly apparent. There was no fresh water source. Any long-term survival would depend on salvaging materials and managing scarce resources. The wreck of the Utile marked the point of no return. The survivors could not refloat the ship. No other vessels were in sight. Tromelin Island was now their only ground, surrounded by open ocean in all directions. The first weeks after the wreck were spent in recovery and assessment. Survivors moved debris above the high-water line and separated what could still be used. Timber from the Utile's hull was dismantled and stacked. Iron fittings were removed and repurposed. Sailcloth was dried and folded. Food stores that had not been spoiled by seawater were inventoried and rationed. Freshwater was the most immediate concern. Tromelin Island had no natural source. Rainwater became the only supply. Survivors used fragments of barrels, metal sheets, and pieces of sailcloth to collect runoff during storms. When rain fell, containers were filled quickly. When it did not, thirst governed every decision. A camp took shape near the center of the island, slightly elevated above the reef. Temporary shelters were built using planks and canvas. Over time, these were reinforced with coral stone. Fire was maintained using salvaged flint and steel. Cooking was done in shallow pits, shielded from the wind by low stone walls. Food came from the sea and the island's limited animal life. Sea turtles nested on the beach at certain times of year. Their meat and eggs were a critical source of protein. Seabirds were captured by hand or with simple tools. Fish were taken from tide pools and shallow waters along the reef. Nothing was wasted. Bones were used as tools. Fat was rendered and stored. The French crew began planning an escape almost immediately. Using materials from the wreck, they constructed a small vessel. The work required cooperation, but authority remained firmly in the hands of the officers. The enslaved Malagasy were compelled to labor, cutting stone, hauling timber, and assisting in construction. After approximately 2 months, the makeshift boat was completed. It was crude, but seaworthy enough to attempt a crossing to Madagascar. Before departing, the officers made a decision that would define the island's history. The Malagasy survivors were left behind. Accounts written later state that the crew promised to return with help. There is no surviving evidence of a formal agreement or timeline. What is documented is that the French crew departed Tromelin, leaving behind around 60 Malagasy men and women with limited supplies and no vessel. Once the boat disappeared beyond the horizon, the structure of survival on the island changed. The remaining group no longer had access to metal tools in significant quantity. Many of the salvaged items had been taken aboard the escape craft. What remained were fragments, a few knives, broken iron pieces, and what could be fashioned from coral, shell, and bone. Over time, the group reorganized. Archaeological evidence collected centuries later indicates that they built more permanent shelters. Low stone structures were constructed with careful placement, suggesting long-term planning rather than improvisation. These dwellings were small and compact, designed to reduce exposure to wind and sun. Fire continued to be maintained generation after generation. This required constant vigilance. Embers were preserved during storms. Fuel came from driftwood and bird remains. The ability to keep fire alive became central to survival, enabling cooking, warmth during cooler nights, and protection from insects. Clothing deteriorated and was replaced with improvised garments made from bird skins and woven fibers. Tools were reshaped repeatedly. Iron fragments were sharpened against coral. Broken objects were reused until they could no longer serve any function. The passage of time on Tromelin was not marked by calendars. Seasons were recognized by weather patterns and animal behavior. Turtle nesting cycles became a measure of years. The group adapted to scarcity through routine. Daily tasks were divided. Water collection, food gathering, shelter maintenance, and fire tending formed the structure of each day. No written records exist from the people left on the island. What is known comes from later rescue accounts and archaeological findings. These indicate sustained, organized survival over many years. The absence of chaos in the material remains suggests discipline rather than collapse. Despite this, numbers declined. Deaths occurred from illness, injury, or exhaustion. Without medical care, even minor wounds could become fatal. Over time, the group grew smaller. The island did not change, but the people upon it did. By the second decade after the wreck, only a handful remained. Their survival was no longer provisional. It had become a way of life bounded entirely by the limits of a barren island and the surrounding sea. As the years passed, survival on Tromelin became more fragile. The routines that had sustained the group could not prevent gradual loss. The island offered consistency, but no margin for error. Each injury, each failed rain season narrowed the possibility of recovery. Archaeological evidence suggests that deaths occurred intermittently rather than in a single catastrophic event. Graves were identified near the stone shelters, marked simply and placed with care. The presence of these burials indicates that the survivors maintained social structure and ritual even as their numbers declined. Health problems accumulated over time. Diets rich in protein but limited in variety led to nutritional deficiencies. Exposure to sun and salt damaged skin and eyes. Cuts from coral and shell were common. Without antiseptics, infections were difficult to control. Skeletal remains show signs of healed fractures as well as injuries that likely proved fatal. Psychological strain increased as the group diminished. With fewer people, tasks became harder to distribute. Fire had to be maintained continuously. Water collection depended entirely on unpredictable rain. A single storm could destroy shelters or scatter stored supplies. Each loss reduced collective resilience. There was no record of attempted escape after the French crew's departure. The materials required to build a seaworthy vessel were no longer available. The reef that had allowed access to land now functioned as a barrier. The surrounding ocean remained active and dangerous with strong currents and frequent swells. Time on the island blurred into repetition. The horizon did not change. Passing ships were rare, and none came close enough to notice signs of habitation. Smoke from cooking fires dissipated quickly in the wind. From a distance, Tromelin appeared empty. By the early 1770s, only a small group remained. Later accounts indicate that the final survivors were women. How this came to be is not fully documented. It may reflect differences in physical endurance, task distribution, or chance. What can be stated with certainty is that survival continued against diminishing odds. The material culture left behind from this period shows refinement rather than decline. Tools became more efficient. Shelters were repaired and reinforced. This suggests that even as the population decreased, knowledge was preserved and applied carefully. Loss on Tromelin was not dramatic. It was cumulative. The island did not impose sudden violence. It wore people down slowly through exposure, limitation, and time. Survival persisted, but it did so under constant pressure, with no external assistance and no confirmation that help would ever come. In November 1776, a French vessel approached Tromelin Island. The ship was the Dauphine, commanded by Lieutenant Jacques-Marie de Tromelin. Its mission was not rescue. It was engaged in routine navigation in the Indian Ocean, operating within the same maritime network that had once carried the Utile. As the Dauphine drew near the island, crew members observed signs that contradicted its assumed emptiness. Smoke was visible above the reef. Upon closer approach, figures could be seen on shore. The island that had been considered uninhabited for years was not empty. A landing party went ashore. They found 7 women and an infant. These were the last known survivors of the Malagasy group abandoned after the wreck of the Utile. They had lived on Tromelin for approximately 15 years. The women were in poor physical condition, but alive. They had constructed stone shelters and maintained fire. They possessed simple tools fashioned from iron fragments and coral. Their clothing was made from bird feathers and skins. They showed clear signs of long-term adaptation to the island's conditions. Accounts written by the crew of the Dauphine describe the rescue in restrained terms. There was no mention of celebration. The women were taken aboard the ship and provided with food, water, and medical attention. The infant, born on the island, survived the journey. The survivors were transported to L'Île-de-France. Upon arrival, they were granted their freedom. This decision was recorded officially, distinguishing their case from standard practice of the time. Their names, however, were largely not preserved in surviving documents. Lieutenant Tromelin's name later became associated with the island. It was named Tromelin in his honor, marking the event that brought the long isolation to an end. The island itself remained uninhabited after their departure. The rescue closed the final chapter of the Utile's wreck. It did not restore what had been lost, nor did it fully account for the years of abandonment. It simply ended the isolation. After the rescue in 1776, Tromelin Island returned to silence. No permanent settlement followed. Ships continued to pass at a distance, and the island resumed its place as a marginal feature on navigational charts. What had occurred there receded into maritime records, noted briefly and then largely forgotten. Centuries later, archaeological expeditions returned to Tromelin. Excavations confirmed the written accounts. Stone shelters were mapped, hearths were identified. Tools made from coral, shell, and salvaged iron were recovered. The material evidence showed deliberate construction, maintenance, and adaptation over many years. Survival had not been accidental. It had been sustained through knowledge, restraint, and continuity. The story of Tromelin does not fit comfortably into heroic narratives. There was no conquest of the environment, no escape engineered against overwhelming odds. Survival occurred within narrow limits. The people left on the island did not overcome isolation so much as endure it. The abandonment following the wreck of the Utile reflects the broader realities of 18th century maritime trade. Decisions were shaped by hierarchy, legality, and expedience. The rescue, 15 years later, corrected nothing beyond the immediate fact of continued survival. Tromelin Island remains physically unchanged. Wind crosses it as it did before 1761. The reef still breaks incoming waves. What distinguishes it historically is not its geography, but the evidence of sustained human presence in a place that offered almost nothing. The significance of the survival lies in its duration and its restraint. Life was maintained without record, without recognition, and without assurance of rescue. When the isolation ended, it did so quietly. What remained was not a monument or a settlement, but proof that survival can persist even when history moves on without notice.